So I just wanted to have a yarn about plyometrics, and when we talk about the development of plyometrics in training for both youth athletes, team sport athletes, runners, anything of the likeness, I feel like it all falls down into three categories. And no matter what you see on social media of people doing all these fancy running drills and plyometrics, they usually fall into one of three categories. So I wanted to go through that today to help you along a little bit further. So, in my opinion, there are three types of these plyometrics. When we talk about plyometrics, again, they have to have a landing and a takeoff. It can't just be a jump. There needs to be a reaction to a ground contact. So, we're not talking about loaded jumps, box jumps. We're talking about plyometrics where there's an impact and a takeoff you have to manage. So, I think there's three areas that you can develop in plyometrics. There's stiffness, elasticity, and coordination. Now, no matter what the plyometric, I think the conditions and the way that you cue and constrain these movements will get results in one of these three categories. So we look at stiffness plyometric. So this first one here, they're characterized by a much quicker contact time. They're going to be a lot more ankle and calf dominant. So you're not going to get a whole lot of knee bend or hip bend or like a deep angle that you would on, say, a CMJ. You're going to get really, really stiff contact. So that first video is a good example. Minimal knee bend coming mainly from the ankle to taking the ground. Allow us to get a quick contact time of under 180 milliseconds. Little angles, and they've got to be simple, looking at one-off movements so you can have a big bang on the ground and take off. Because as we add complexity, it gets harder to keep that contact time. Can test it in many different ways. Drop, jump, 10-5 test. Looking again at contact timing and how big an RSI is. When it comes to training it, we want to progressively overload as we do with everything. This is going to come with overloading the entry speed or the entry velocity with external resistance or a bigger drop height. The more that we can overload that entry velocity, the more the athlete is going to have to react quickly to that ground contact to keep the contact time low and get off the ground. These are going to be pretty high intensity stimulus, so we're going to have to keep the contacts low, generally under 20, but even lower than probably 15. Some examples here of this kind of stiffness training. We've got the one on the left, which is a one-off contact off a plate, a pogo and return, as I would call it. Very, very simple to execute in the sense that they have to manage one ground contact at a time. The more you string back to back to back to back, the harder it's going to be for someone to get them all under that good contact time. So just one, bang, reset, go again. There's our video again of our testing, but that's our best example of a drop jump. Nice quick contact time there. And this is an example of an overload. So it uses resistance bands to provide an increased entry speed into the pogo. So there has to be a quicker pickup of that reactivity. Elastic plyometrics, in contrast to that, are going to have a longer ground contact time. And that's largely because they have a larger kind of bend out of the knee and the hip. So there's going to be a deeper squat that comes out of it to then explode. You're still going to want simple movements with good intent to make sure you're achieving the movement properly. Again, the more complex the movement gets, the harder it's going to be to produce force quickly. Usually you would test pure elasticity on a counter movement jump, and that's a little bit contrarian to the way the presentation is going because there's no contact time on a counter movement jump. That's going to be the best assessment of elasticity, but we can train it through plyometrics. Looking at eccentric velocity durations and concentric velocities or any output measure on a counter movement jump is a good way. Similar to the stiffness, we're looking at increasing the entry speed or a drop height. So thinking maybe a depth jump versus a drop jump, where you can have a longer ground contact time, produce a higher jump height, more force, but using your bigger leg muscles like your quads and your glutes. We can also train it through power. So counter jump, good example, where there's no plyometric aspect because there's no ground contact, but there is that eccentric and concentric phase. Some examples here, a lot of vertical elements over a hurdle, managing up like that. You're going to see, compared to the other ones, a longer time spent on the ground and deeper angles through the knee and the hip. Now, this allows them to project higher and get a higher takeoff than what there was on the stiffness variations. You just have to know it's going to be a different outcome than with the stiffness. Now, looking at coordination, this is the third category, and this is where probably I see a lot of the Instagram exercises, I guess I could say, fall into this category, where they're extremely complex, for better or for worse. And because of this complexity, it's really hard to keep a low ground contact time and high force output. So testing them to become more multi-directional, they're going to be more brain training is probably a good way to put it, where there's going to be an increased demand of the athlete to control their body in space, and maybe they're moving laterally, maybe it's rotational, maybe they're overcoming more obstacles such as hurdles that are laid out in a different way, and they're going to improve their ability to move well, to have enhanced movement options. And largely this is subjective, so really you're only testing it from the eye test. There may be some factors that play from peak height velocity if you're dealing with for youth athletes in a long-term development setting, that just exposing them to these different types of coordination plyometrics through various stages of their growth phases may be beneficial. But largely what you want to look for is just an increase in movement complexity without a decrease in the movement ability. So it's no use making the movement overly complex to the point where it just ruins someone's confidence where they can't get it done. You want to make the movement complex enough that they can solve it, but they have to think their way through it as well. And because they're thinking their way through it, as we've said a million times, it's going to be slower, less forceful, so you can probably do it at a higher training volume without too much impact, I suppose. Now, some examples here. Again, we're looking multi-directional, going over obstacles. They're going to be a little bit slower and thinking their way through. Now, you are going to get some kind of carryover effects to other elements, so there will be some elements of stiffness and elasticity that kind of flow on from this. But I've put them in this category purely because they're not pure examples of stiffness or elasticity. If you're training these modalities, you're probably not getting the best effects on your stiffness and elasticity versus the more simpler variations I showed earlier. If you're dealing with team sport or multi-directional athletes, these should be a foundation where you want people to produce force in different planes and absorb force through different planes of movement. Dealing with runners, maybe not as much. Maybe in early phases, you can go a little bit more extensively and build a bit of a base foundation in a general prep cycle. But largely, you want to go back to these kind of big stiffness plyometrics that are much simpler. Same with these elastic. They're really simple. Bang, bang, bang. Now, a couple of other considerations to go through with plyometrics is how strong the tissue is. So we're talking about stiffness plyometrics. It's going to be really calf dominant. So just knowing how strong someone's calf tissue is going to tell you a lot about their ability to both produce really good stiffness plyometrics, but also handle the training load. So if you test them and say you're doing any calf isometric tests, endurance training, or just getting a good measure of what their calf strength is, they might not even be strong enough to tolerate plyometric training or strong enough to produce enough force for a good stiffness plyometric. So you kind of have to balance both sides, that you can see them go through these tests on the plyos, and that will tell you a lot about them, but you got to make sure you're aware of their actual tissue strength as well. Another element that comes into programming is what people are doing outside of the gym. Now, this particularly pertains to runners, that if anyone is tracking a high level of Ks outside the gym, so if they're running 50, 60, 80, and even some of our long distance runners here are running over 100, 120 Ks in a week, that's a lot of these kind of low amplitude foot contacts that are just occurring throughout their weekly training load and volume. So knowing that anything that you sprinkle on top of that, one, could be pushing them closer to bone stress potentially and increasing their risk of stress. But you also might just be wasting your time, that particularly when we talk about extensive plyometrics, so low impact pogos where we're not going for max kind of force, that they've probably built up a high level of adaptations already to this stimulus because they do it so often in their running. So you're probably better off attacking it more so from the intensity standpoint and giving them a higher box drop or increased resistance on a drop jump, and you might get better results in their stiffness rather than the slower, extensive plyometrics that they're technically doing every time they go out and run. And the third part is just knowing what someone needs and when. So broad LTAD standpoint, looking at, okay, when do we progress someone from some coordination plyometrics into elastic into stiffness? Now, the answer here is probably you're doing all of them in some capacity at every time, and you're just playing around with the ratios and progressing them accordingly. But just knowing the athlete in front of you, or you yourself, if you're coaching yourself, what do you need to work on? And this is going to depend on your own strength, your own ability, your sporting background and training loads, many, many different things. But knowing that you don't always chase each one at the same time to 100% capacity. Hopefully this clears a lot of things up with plyometrics and how you may implement them or test them in a gym environment. My details are here if you want to reach out and send any questions, and happy to talk it through further.